Well, thank you all for being here this morning. This is one of those discussions that could go on for a full quarter of the year or in about 5 minutes, but we're going to talk a little bit about a very epic period in the life of Jesus Christ. But in the meantime, as you can see on the screen, there is a time in life when you might have heard these words. When I was a kid, my brother usually would do something wrong, and then I'd get blamed for it. My mother would come after me to administer whatever needed to be administered at that moment, usually with a yardstick, maybe with a switch, maybe with a chainsaw or whatever she could get her hands on. But I was quick enough that I could usually stay ahead of her, and I could get around the table and behind a chair or something like that, and she couldn't catch up. And this was a very temporary victory that I could score, because pretty soon she'd put her hands on her hips and she'd say this: "Just wait till your father gets home." Now the problem with that is that my mother was a very small person, my dad was a very big person. He weighed over 200 pounds, he had done hard physical work all of his life. His hands were about the size of tennis rackets and about the consistency of railroad ties. So when I had to undergo some kind of discipline from Dad, I really knew it. And you hear these dreaded words and you try to find ways to put them off. And the worst part of it is, far beyond the physical, was waiting for the rest of the day until he got there. A whole day to just dread this moment that was going to occur someplace around 6 o'clock at night. And it made for a very long and a very terrible kind of a day. And this sort of thing can happen even on a bigger scale. For instance, one of the great blessings that God has given us is that we don't come with an expiration date. And that is, we don't know exactly when the time will come that we will make our transition to the next phase. It's a great thing, because if we didn't, we would be approaching that time, and then we would have that same long sense of dread and fear that I experienced waiting for Dad to get home to do whatever it was that he was going to do. There is a case, at least one case, where somebody did know biblically when he was going to pass on. And it's an Old Testament account, and I've lost this on button. I'm going to have to get expert help. And here it comes. This is an Old Testament account of a man whose name was Hezekiah. He was probably the best king that Judah ever had. And there weren't many really good kings in the Old Testament, but he was one of the few. And he was faced with his death. He was lying very sick. He was still a young man. He was probably in his 30s. And he prayed earnestly that he could have some more time. And God granted that to him. He sent a prophet named Isaiah to him to tell him that he was giving him 15 more years to live. Now that's a really great blessing in a lot of respects, and particularly for the first 10 or 12 years perhaps, it would seem like a very long time out there. And if somebody said, "I'm guaranteeing you that you'll live for the next 15 years, your tendency might be to say, well, I can go back to smoking, I can stop using sunblock, I can eat all the hamburgers at McDonald's that I want." But when the last year or so gets there and reality starts to set in, then that kind of dread of waiting till your father gets home happens. So there's an even bigger case of that, obviously, that we will see in just a minute. We're going to talk about what I've called the 8 most important days in history. These are the last days of Jesus. It begins on the day of his so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and it's going to end with his resurrection. And it's kind of interesting to see what this means to us. And Paul pointed this out very succinctly. He said, if there is no resurrection, we just don't have any business being here. It is the very foundation of what we have come to be as Christians. Without it, he said, our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. So the resurrection is something that is absolutely essential to the human faith. How do we know that it happened? Well, again, Luke opened his book, his treatise, with these words. He said, a lot of people have tried to draw up an account of what's going on, but he said, what I'm writing to you, to a man named Theophilus, what I'm writing to you is based on eyewitness accounts. So here we have someone who isn't claiming that his information came from esoteric sources or came from something he stumbled across. He essentially is saying, I've heard from the people who saw these things happen, and therefore you know that they are going to be true. Now, what needs to be pointed out is Jesus knew when, where, and how he was going to die. There was no question in his mind. He tried at least 3 times to tell his disciples when, where, and how he was going to die, but either because they just simply didn't want to believe it, or whether it was a case of their completely ignoring something that was going to be inconvenient for them, we don't know, but they wouldn't accept it. They just simply seemed not to understand what the plan was that was going to result in the end of his life. He took the 12 aside. It says, we're going up to Jerusalem. It's interesting, it always says up to Jerusalem, and that's a geographic fact because Jerusalem was higher than any place around. We're going up to Jerusalem, and everything written in the prophets is going to come true. But still, they couldn't understand that. On the 3rd day, he will rise again, meaning it. It's also interesting to point out on these 8 days how the writers of the New Testament saw them in importance. Luke, for instance, devotes 40% of his book to the final 8 days of Jesus' earthly ministry. The other apostles devote from 20 to 30% of their books. Jesus lived on earth something like 1,700 weeks, and yet 1 week occupies the biggest part of each of the 4 Gospels. That emphasizes what these 8 days may have meant. And the final week started with his going up to Jerusalem and telling his apostles to find a donkey for him to ride. And it always kind of interested me because it says that donkey had never been ridden. And having grown up watching rodeos, I wonder exactly what the reaction of a donkey might have been in being ridden for the first time, but apparently it was a pretty docile animal because he mastered it. Now, they were going to Jerusalem from Bethany. Jesus and the 12 apostles had moved in with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, which in itself might have been kind of an adventure because suddenly here are 13 people moving into a house that probably was no more than a couple of 100 square feet, and it became evident that they were going to be spending the week there. Nonetheless, that's where they stayed. They were about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, so it took them basically half an hour to walk from the home in Bethany to the place where this donkey was tied. And the reason they were coming, beyond the fact that the crucifixion was in the offing, was because it was the Passover. And the Passover, of course, is the most important to Jewish people of all of the festivals of their faith. And it must have been an incredible kind of a sight. They estimate that from 600,000 to 1 million people came to Jerusalem for these Passover festivals. Jerusalem itself at that time, the wall part of the city, was only about a square mile. So here were all of these people from all over the Mediterranean world, speaking half a dozen or more languages, crammed into this tiny, small space. There was hardly room to move. And they were speaking, they were celebrating. On top of that, there were about 500,000 sheep being driven into that same enclosure with these people. Their throats were being slit. People were catching blood in pans, part of the offering process, to be sacrificed on the altar. So it had to be a sight that just almost is beyond comprehension to see. Huge throngs of people. And Jesus comes into all of that kind of mess, if you will, riding on a donkey. But he was recognized, and he was recognized for who he was. By this time, he had been traveling for basically 3 years throughout Galilee and the rest of the so-called New Testament world, and he had built a huge following. People knew him. He could be a person to whom you could go to get wisdom. He was a person to whom you could go to be healed, and that probably was the most attractive part to people at that era. He had a huge following, and everyone wanted to see him, and there they were thronging around him. Jerusalem is built beside a little valley called the Kidron, Kidron, and the Mount of Olives is on the far side and Jerusalem on the other, and Bethany put them on a route where they would walk through that valley to come in. So they come in through a gate. He's riding on this donkey, and this is on Monday, April the 3rd in the year 30 AD, as nearly as that time can be fixed. And he is going to spend 8 days, starting with this day, up to the time of his crucifixion. And interestingly, on one of those days, Wednesday, no one's quite sure what he did. There's no mention in the historical record or the biblical record. So he took a day off in the middle of that week, and everything he did was really done in about 4 days. And one of the most important things about this series of days is he did a lot. Now, most people, or I think most people, I certainly would, if I came to church this morning knowing I was going to be crucified on Friday, it would make a big difference probably in how I spent my week. I really don't know what I would do except maybe look at my watch a lot to see how much time was left. That's the natural human reaction. But for Jesus, it was a frenzy of activity. He began predicting things that were going to happen. He began talking to people. He began teaching some of the lessons we most remember, all during this 8-day period that really boils down to about a 4-day period. And for instance, he took a look around at the city where he was visiting, and he actually cried. He knew what was going to happen to Jerusalem. As you probably know, in the first century, there was a great deal of tension between the Romans and the Jews, and there was a continuing series of uprisings, of revolts. And the problem that the Romans had and that the Roman rulers had was trying to contain the Jewish revolts, keeping everything quiet and calm. The last major revolt had happened a couple of years before Jesus was born, in 3 or 4 BC. So they had gone by this time a little over 30 years with relative calm, except every day there were people here and there who were leading many revolts, trying to get rid of Roman rule, and very often the leadership of the Jewish community, because the priests and high priests were considered to be people who were taking advantage of the common people. They were considered about like the Romans were. So Jesus saw what was going to happen. And about 35 years after his crucifixion, things would really come to a boil, and Jerusalem would be torn to the ground. And in fact, it would not come back under Jewish control until the 1960s. So almost 2 millennia passed from this moment in about 70 BC, or AD rather, that Jesus is prophesying, and he cries because he knows the horror that's going to be happening. He cleared the temple. From one sense, this was a very important thing religiously, and that is the Old Testament had talked about how important the temple was to God and how it was not to be a den of thieves. You'll see a couple of references there to Old Testament scriptures in Isaiah and in Jeremiah. But this was something that was to be kept pure. But for the second time, Jesus, in this final week of his, found the money changers, the people who were selling doves, the people who were trying to make a profit off what was going on with all of these hundreds of thousands of people. This really upset the priesthood because the priesthood, and specifically the high priest, had the concession for selling doves and changing money in the temples. They got a cut off all of this huge tourist business that was going on. So when we see the Sanhedrin and the high priest reacting to Jesus as they did, it wasn't simply a religious question in their mind, it was very much a commercial question. Jesus said, "My house is not going to be a den of robbers," and he upset the tables, he let the doves go free, just adding to the confusion of this 500,000 people milling around in a very small place in Jerusalem. And then he set an example for his disciples, for Christians, for people everywhere. Not so much just washing feet, but for putting himself in a position of humility. These lessons you remember that he's teaching right now are the last ones he's going to be teaching before his resurrection, and the last ones, the newest ones, that we have a record of, with a couple of very minor exceptions. So one of the last and most important lessons he was teaching was the lesson of humility. People didn't wash other people's feet unless they were humbling themselves before them. It was an important gesture, and there had just been a great argument among the apostles about who was going to be the greatest, and Jesus was making the point, you got to be great by serving. This little story is one that kind of mystifies me, frankly. But you'll recall that Jesus and the apostles walked by a fig tree, and the fig tree didn't have any fruit. In fact, it probably wasn't even the fruit-bearing season when they walked past it. But Jesus withered the fig tree. And then he concluded it saying to the apostles, when they asked him how he did it, he said, if you have enough faith, you can say to that mountain to go into the sea, and it will go there. His lesson wasn't really how to get rid of the tree you don't want. It really was a lesson in teaching the strength of faith and what it meant and why it was so important. He also spent some time comforting his disciples. They finally began to understand that he was not going to be with them forever. And this was really a jarring realization to them because they had spent 3 years traveling, no home, probably sparse rations, a lot of discomfort, sleeping under the stars, and all these kind of things that you might not want to do if you're not going to be rewarded for it in some way. And suddenly the anchor to all that, the rock, the place where they had placed their faith, says, I'm going away. But, he says, I'm going there to prepare a place for you. This passage in John 14 is one we frequently use at funerals because it expresses the hope that Christians have, that Christ followers have, of spending eternity with Jesus. But he does this directly to let his apostles know where they stand in the scheme of things. Another theme of these final days for Jesus is a rather constant run-in with the Jewish leadership. Now, this has been going on for years, but it seems to intensify in this last week, and it does in part because they are all crammed together again in these cramped quarters of the city of Jerusalem, everyone there for the Passover. And there is friction, obviously, coming from their nearness to each other. Jesus is constantly having to outthink his detractors, and for the most part, his detractors are the leaders of the Pharisees. So he was teaching a lesson. The Pharisees basically said to him, "How are you qualified to do this?" And Jesus answered by asking a couple of questions about how they felt about authority. And when they wouldn't answer them directly, he said, "I'm not going to answer you either." And he assumes and keeps the authority he has. One of the key things to see in these accounts of the last 8 days of Jesus is how he constantly outwits his adversaries in what seem to be many debates. And this is a key thing. He promises the Holy Spirit to his followers. "I'm going away," he said, "but I'm going to give you someone who will be with you forever." And that's the Spirit of truth, or the Holy Spirit. "I'm asking my Father for that," he said. But he prefaces it with an important idea. "If you love me, you will obey my commands." And therefore, it says directly that the coming of the Holy Spirit to comfort people and to lead them and to be their counselor is based upon their continuing to follow what he's taught them and to obey the commands that he's given. There are several parables that were given in this final week of his. And I realize in calling this a final week that there is a period after his resurrection that probably lasted as long as 6 weeks. But this final week up to the resurrection time is really the time for which we have the great record and the great record of his teachings. And he was using his teachings in many, many cases to let his detractors among the religious leaders of the day know what he thought about them. And he's talking in this particular case about people who are given a lot and then don't use it. And the parable applied directly to the Pharisees, and they knew it and they were rebuked by it. And in every one of these instances where Jesus gets into some kind of a discussion, particularly with the Pharisees, the anger and resentment toward him builds even more because they are looking for ways that will justify their taking his life. Again, the parable of the wedding banquet, where the young women are invited and don't come at the right time. Pardon me, no, that's the wrong one. This is the one where a lot of people are invited and they don't show up, and he sends people out to the hedgerows to gather up the homeless to come into the wedding banquet. The key thing is many are invited, but not many get there. Directed again primarily at the religious leadership of the day against those who are basing their religion on things other than the way it's being taught, and that'll show up a little later. This is an interesting one because it's another effort to trap Jesus, and this time it comes not from the Pharisees but from the Sadducees. And it's interesting because the Sadducees are, as a group, do not believe in eternal life or a resurrection from the dead, that death ends it all. The Sadducees, of course, were sort of the upper crust, if you will, of Jewish society at that time. They were people who tended to be more educated. They were probably wealthier as a group, and they were partially skeptical. If you went to a Jewish synagogue today, you would find a similar kind of division still exists. They no longer call them Pharisees and Sadducees, but the effect is pretty much the same. But at any rate, in this particular encounter, The Sadducees present him with a question about a woman who was married 7 times and each of her husbands dies. And they ask Jesus, whose wife will she be at the resurrection? And Jesus points out that that's not really a problem. God is the God of the living. He's not the God of the dead in this case, because the Sadducees believe that she will be only, that when she dies, she will be only dead, and there's no worrying about any spouse in that. Another interesting one, another case where Jesus really outwits the question that's posed to him in an effort to trap him into saying something that's going to convict him in the eyes of his detractors. What's the greatest commandment of the law? And he doesn't answer that, really. The law does not say, love the God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and then it goes on to say, love your neighbor as yourself. It actually says, love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus inserts this in his answer to the question that was asked. And once again, he didn't have to pick out one of the laws, either from the Levitical law, from the Pharisaic law, from the Sadducees' laws. The Pharisees at this point had 614 laws. And that was one of the things that really kept people encumbered. It was almost impossible to turn around, live a normal life, and not stumble over some kind of a Pharisaic rule. And in fact, among the most conservative Jews in today's Israel, that situation still pretty much exists. One of their great debates is whether you're doing work on the Sabbath by closing the refrigerator door and letting the light come on. It is an absolute subject of debate still. So it was the kind of thing that was really an encumbrance. And Jesus goes beyond that. Love God. Don't worry about some of these other things. Whose son is the Christ? Well, again, a constant attempt to undermine Jesus' authority. And he goes on in this answer to point out David calls him Lord, calls Jesus Lord. Therefore, he can't be the true son of David. And this is an interesting kind of a thing, and it may be good for some of us who try to teach a class or preach a sermon or something. Jesus is saying, do as they say and don't do as they do. Measure people by their actual lives, but if they are properly teaching from the scriptures, then do the things they say you should do. And the widow's offering is probably one of the best known comments that Jesus made, and it's a very short part of the Gospels, but he does make a key point. She put in everything. She is one of the few persons that he actually commends for their lifestyle. He sees this apparently very poor woman who has nothing left but 2 coins. She drops those into the offering and goes on her way. And that, Jesus says, is the true essence of someone who wants to follow him. Signs at the end of the coming of the age are interesting. I can remember as a kid having heard this, checking the moon just about every night to see what color it was, to be certain that that wasn't the day that the world was going to come to an end. It scared me half to death. But he will send angels. He will gather his elect from the 4 corners of the earth. If you read the full passage, it talks about the moon turning to blood or blood red. Talents is similar to an earlier story that he told, but in this case, it's the man who is given 5 talents, turns his into 10, given 2 talents, turns his into 5, and so on. For everyone who's given more, he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And that doesn't mean that poor people are going to wind up in worse shape than rich people. It means that those who produce more in God's kingdom are going to be rewarded, and those who fail to produce will not be. Interesting to think about Judas. And one of the key sentences in this is, then Satan entered Judas. You always wonder how a guy like Judas could exist. He was one who was close to Jesus. Jesus had picked him out, he'd chosen him, he'd given him a position of responsibility. That is, he was the treasurer of their little group. And yet he finally, at the end, chose to betray him. And you even wonder, why on earth would he need to betray him? Jesus was a well-known figure. He was seen in public day in and day out, particularly during this final week of his earthly ministry. And yet they wanted somebody who could help set up his arrest. And the reason for it seems to be is that, number one, they did not want a public arrest. Remember a few minutes ago we talked about the fact that there was great tension between the Jews and the Romans. And the Romans absolutely did not want something that would set off rioting in the streets or a great commotion that could lead to further rebellion. So the idea in arresting Jesus very quietly and away from the crowds was to avoid just exactly that sort of public reaction that would create problems for the Roman leadership and the Jewish leadership. So they needed to find a way and a place that Jesus could be arrested without setting off this 500,000 people who had gathered in Jerusalem for the Passover. And they needed someone who could guide the arresting party to Jesus in an out-of-the-way place. And that's what Judas agreed to do. And furthermore, you remember that was a time when there weren't wanted posters, there weren't pictures of people around, so it would be hard to identify him. And you consider that, as it turned out, they arrested him at night, it would be hard to pick him out of the group. Here were 12 bearded guys wearing white robes all together, and it would be difficult if you didn't really know them to pick out the one you wanted. So again, the arresting party needed someone like Judas who could lead them to Jesus in a place where they wouldn't be in public and identify him at the proper time. Now, Jesus goes into a great teaching that has to do with the sheep and the goats. And he says that at the time of the judgment, the sheep will go in one direction and the goats in the other, and the sheep are the good guys and the goats are the bad guys. But this is the teaching that's very important to us, because leading into that, Jesus talks about, you visited me while I was in prison, you fed me when I was hungry, and all of these kinds of teachings that are very familiar to us. And then he goes into this. The nations will be gathered and divided as sheep and goats. And the sheep will be those people who visited Jesus in prison and who were compassionate toward him and compassionate toward his cause. And the goats will be those who are left out on the other side and go into eternal punishment. The vine and the branches, these tremendous teachings that have had such an impact on Christianity through the years were just given one right after the others in basically a 2 and 3 day period. I am the vine and branches, and this is my command. Love each other. You're all part of this vine and these branches. Finally, the world is going to hate you because you're a disciple of mine. And that's largely been true, and it particularly was true for the first few hundred years that Christianity existed, because there was almost constant persecution. Jesus foretold it. There's still persecution in places in the world, but nonetheless, it was really prevalent, and it was prevalent at that time. This is another Judas story, really. Jesus was anointed. Mary Magdalene poured expensive perfume on him. The disciples reacted. Judas reacted. Why on earth are you letting her do this? She's wasting that very expensive perfume by pouring it all over you. And Jesus defended her greatly. Leave her alone. This was intended to be used at my burial, but she's chosen to use it now. The disciples' grief will ultimately turn to joy, Jesus said. And that will come really when they recognize that his resurrection has occurred. He tells them about the Holy Spirit coming to guide them in the way of the truth. The argument arose about who is the greatest in the kingdom. And again, you remember Jesus humbling himself by washing his disciples' feet, and he is emphasizing to his followers that the greatest will be those who serve the most. Jesus' prayer, his longest prayer that's recorded in John 17, is divided into three parts. For himself, he prays for his disciples, and he prays for his followers. And it always is important, I believe, to read again, may they be brought to complete unity, speaking of his followers, to let the world know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. He prays earnestly for unity among his followers. He established the Lord's Supper. For people who like to get entangled in these kinds of things, there was always an argument as to whether Thursday night was truly a part of the Passover and the Passover feast. Well, it depends on which calendar you use. The Pharisees used the lunar calendar, and based on the lunar calendar, Thursday was appropriate for the Passover feast. The Sadducees used a solar calendar, and based on the solar calendar, it was not. So the world can always argue as to whether it was truly the Passover feast or just a dinner that Jesus had, but it all boils down to which calendar you're using and to whether it had any importance at all. Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him, and of course Peter said, "No, I won't," and then did. One of the most important to me prayers or ideas of Jesus' last day or so is this prayer, where he goes to the garden that's across the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem itself, and he prays at this point to let this cup be taken away from me. He did not want to go through with the crucifixion that he saw looming basically the next morning, and he prayed fervently that that would happen. And it always kind of seems as if God just ignored it. That's not the case. God did not grant his request to take the cup from him in the form of letting the crucifixion not occur, but he did send someone to comfort him, an angel to comfort him, so that he was able to go through with it. God did answer his prayer, just not in the way we might read that he wanted it. Here's the time when Judas actually gave the signal that led to Jesus' arrest. Again, they needed a Judas to identify him, take him where he could be arrested, and they did that. He's taken to Annas, who was the high priest that year. Annas was a guy in his mid-50s. The high priest at that time served at the pleasure of Rome. And Annas had a problem in that he wanted Jesus put to death, but he did not have the authority to do it. Annas was a direct descendant of Zadok, who was the high priest to David, and Jesus was a descendant of David. So here were these two people, 20 or so centuries apart, who were thrown together at this moment when Jesus was going to be crucified, and as a result of it. Now, Annas, again, had a pecuniary interest as well as a spiritual interest in what was going to happen, because Jesus raiding the temple upset his revenue stream, and it wasn't a good idea as far as he was concerned. They then went to the Sanhedrin. Annas, incidentally, was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who also plays a major part in what's going on in Jesus' trial. Peter, of course, did disown Jesus, and then Judas killed himself. Threw the 30 shekels into the valley, or into the temple rather, as he walked by, because the Jews wouldn't take back the money. Jesus went before Pilate. Pilate's an interesting guy in that he made kind of a half-hearted attempt to keep Jesus from being crucified. And there are stories about what happened to him later. About 6 years after this event, he lost his job. He had sent a Roman expeditionary force to put down another preacher who was a Samaritan, and it was a brutal put down, and Rome recalled him, and he no longer was running things in Jerusalem. And he was then sent apparently to France, and in Vienne, France, there is what is supposedly Pilate's tomb. There's a monument there. He also is said to have gone to what now is Switzerland. And near Geneva, and according to the story, he threw himself into a lake to drown, really on Roman orders. And he is considered by some to be a martyr. And in fact, the Ethiopian church and the Coptic church both consider Pilate to be a martyr and is included in their list of martyrs. Whether any of that happens, I have no idea, but nonetheless, that sometimes is thought of. The soldiers, of course, mocked Jesus, they beat Jesus, and then they crucified him. Horrible death, but the best news, I suppose, physically for Jesus was that he didn't linger on the cross very long by Roman standards. There were occasions when people who were being crucified hung for 2 or 3 or 4 days before they actually died, and Jesus' death came in a matter of 3 or 4 hours. So in that sense, there was a bit of mercy attached to it. He died, as we all know, there was a reaction, physical reaction in the world around him. Buried him. There was a great rush to get him buried. They needed to bury him before sundown, so that burial would not occur on the Sabbath. They put a guard at the tomb to be certain that no one came and stole the body, and then came the resurrection on Sunday morning. And again, going back to the beginning of what we were talking about today, this event is the cornerstone of our faith as Christians. If there was no resurrection, there really is no Christianity. So in one sense, this may be the most important passage in the New Testament. It is the account of his being found alive again after his death. Well, I think that took us to the minute, which is what I wanted to do, so there would not be time for questions. So thank you very much for all your attention.